Okay, welcome to this latest of our Post-Brexit Clinics from Queen's University Belfast. I'm David Phinnemore and I'm joined today by my colleague Katy Hayward to talk to you about Northern Ireland, the Windsor Framework and UK-EU relations, and essentially spend a fair amount of time looking at the results of the polling that was recently carried out by Lucid Talk on our behalf, looking into the views of voters in Northern Ireland on the Windsor Framework and UK-EU relations. Okay, that's what we're going to focus on. We're going to take you through some of the results, give a bit of our analysis, and then also talk about a few other things which are going on in terms of the Windsor Framework, notably the report from Lord Murphy was recently published on his independent review. We'll also want to have a look about the future of the UK-EU relationship, and discuss some of the activities and possible developments there as well. Okay, so I'm going to kick off just by saying a little bit of context for this latest poll. We carried it out in October. It comes against the background of quite a significant development in UK-EU relations, and that was the summit back in May of this year, where the UK and the EU made a number of commitments about how they want to enhance cooperation, deepen cooperation between themselves over the coming years. That's important from a Northern Ireland perspective because a good number of the developments that are anticipated there will have an impact on how the Windsor Framework itself is implemented and how the effects of that play out, particularly around the movement of goods from Great Britain to Northern Ireland. Okay. What we also have as part of the context for this is some shift in public opinion in terms of support for the political parties in Northern Ireland. You see here the latest regular polling for Lucid Talk published in the Belfast Telegraph. What we note here is the slight drop in DUP support, slight increase in TUV support, and then obviously the support for Sinn Féin that we have there. You've essentially got the more hardline nationalist, hardline unionists being the largest political parties in Northern Ireland, and the middle ground has arguably lost some support over the last year or so. Okay, so we're mindful of that as we go through our analysis of the results. The other key developments that I've already alluded to, one is the report which Lord Murphy published on his independent review of the Windsor Framework. This was triggered by the outcome of the democratic consent vote back in December last year. His recommendations came out at the beginning of this month, but also, and this came out after we did the polling, this is a report, quite a detailed report from the Northern Ireland Scrutiny Committee, looking at how you might strengthen Northern Ireland's voice in the context of the Windsor Framework. A good number of recommendations there, reflecting, I think, a fair amount of engagement with stakeholders in Northern Ireland. Okay, so we will work our way through the polling. I'm going to hand over here to Katy, who's going to take us through some of the early parts of it.
Thanks, David. Afternoon, everybody. So, yes, this is our 14th poll, believe it or not, and we're doing them every 6 months now. So this poll was conducted at the beginning of October, and the response rate was slightly down on previous years' polls, so slightly below 2,000. The sample size for this is 1,200 for the representative sample, and the results are presented with a margin of error of 2.3%. The straightforward questions with respect to trying to gather people's opinion on the Windsor Framework, we actually haven't seen a great deal of change on this. Those dark lines there, those vertical dark lines, show the strong agrees from our previous poll in April. And we can see there's been a slight decline in those strongly agreeing that the Windsor Framework provides economic opportunities for Northern Ireland. There hasn't been movement on opinions around whether Brexit's on balance a good thing for the UK. If you remember in our last poll, we saw that go up slightly post-Trump. But for the most part, we have 63% of people disagreeing that it is. We've seen a slight increase in people strongly agreeing that particular arrangements are necessary for Northern Ireland. But then we come to the questions on whether the Windsor Framework is the right arrangement. And we've seen a slight drop in those thinking it's on balance a good thing for Northern Ireland, most particularly as quite a significant decline in those strongly thinking that it is so, and also a slight drop in those thinking that it provides appropriate means for managing Brexit. There's still low views about whether, so under 50% of people thinking reliable information on the Windsor Framework is available, but yet still quite a good amount of self-confidence when it comes to people's view of understanding the protocol. So our time series analysis here in relation to the question of whether the Windsor Framework's on balance a good thing for Northern Ireland. So we can look back to the spring of 2021 on this particular question, and we can see how things have changed over time. And we noticed there previously that drop for the strongly agreeing, so that's dropped down by 5 percentage points. So what this means is that we have come down to below 50% of people thinking it's on balance a good thing for Northern Ireland. And what seems to have happened is that they've moved more into the undecided realm, and we haven't seen a very significant shift amongst those disagreeing that it's on balance good. So over time, if you look at that period, post-safeguarding the union, there's just been a gradual decline, which is only a couple of percentage points each time, but when you add them all together, you see there has been quite a significant drop from the 56% that it was after the Windsor Framework down now to 48%, which is the lowest it's been since the summer of 21. When we look at opinions on the Windsor Framework in terms of political affiliation, particularly on the constitutional question, again, we can see some interesting trends here. So that black bar there, line there showing you the total opinion of people thinking that it's on balance a good thing, so agreeing that it is. The strong unionists, after the safeguarding the union, there was a slight uptick in those thinking it's on balance good, but that's back down now to 5%. What's been notable, and I think we noticed this in our last poll, is the drop amongst slight unionists. That's gone up very slightly, but that's a very significant decline since post-safeguarding from 51 down to 29. But the interesting movement here is perhaps amongst the neithers, the neutrals, and amongst nationalists. So very significant drop, again, when you put it all together, post-Windsor Framework, particularly amongst those who are non-aligned, in opinions that the Windsor Framework is on balance a good thing. So that's just an interesting trend that's worth noting after the period that we've had since Windsor Framework was agreed. On particular issues, whether the impact of the protocol Windsor Framework is positive or negative, generally speaking, there's positive views about it in relation to no diminution of rights, protecting the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, North-South cooperation. Generally speaking, negative opinions about its impact on Northern Ireland's place in the UK internal market and constitutional place in the UK. There's been a slight change in relation to the views about its impact on UK-EU relations, probably because, of course, we have had such a significant improvement in that relationship, notably from the summit. And there hasn't been much other movement otherwise. In relation to the economy, again, we noticed in our last poll that it dropped slightly, hasn't changed much this time round. So generally, people think it has a more positive than a negative effect. And political stability is more or less evenly divided. Notably, we have seen a decline in those thinking it has a negative impact on no diminution of rights, and that may or may not be because of the news in relation to the Supreme Court case, perhaps on the Dillon case, the government's appeal around that. So maybe that's affecting that view there. In relation to trust, so some interesting data here. The most significant change we noted is this time in terms of decline in trust in the UUP, down now to 17%. When we look across, what this means is the TUV is the most trusted unionist party when it comes to managing Northern Ireland's interests in relation to the Windsor Framework. However, you can't help but notice too the very high levels of distrust for the TUV and also for the DUP. The DUP shares the same level of distrust, or people share the same level of distrust in the DUP as in the UK government, which is back down now to single figures from having been 11% in our previous poll. If we look at this over time, so from summer of 21, what we notice really, there hasn't been a major amount of change. So oftentimes we've said that the Irish government, trust in the Irish government is similar to that of the EU, and that's more or less remained the same. Trust in Northern Ireland business representatives remains higher than any other group, although that too has declined over time from safeguarding the union. The most significant movement has come in relation to the Northern Ireland Executive. Unsurprisingly, when it became established again, there was an increase in trust in it, but that has steadily declined since as well. On the parties, you can see there's rather less trust in some of the parties, particularly amongst unionist parties. And this relates generally, I think, to unionist opinion with respect to the Windsor framework. We've seen declining trust in the DUP and the UUP since safeguarding. The TUV has actually increased the trust in it has increased since safeguarding the union, and we see very consistent results there for Alliance, the SDLP, and Sinn Féin. And then we asked a question again that we asked a few times in previous polls. So we gave people a list of 10 issues of concern, and we wanted to see originally where people put the effects of the Windsor Framework Protocol in that list of 10. This is broadly speaking an indication of what comes out top, so we've just put it straightforwardly here in terms of where these issues are ranked, whether that's the dark green there is the highest, 1 to 3, the light green is people putting it sort of in their middle issues of concern, and then the grey is those the proportion putting it in their lowest issues of concern. So health and social care, the economy, cost of living are out on top, followed by public service delivery. We've seen a slight decline in those thinking strongly, so putting it in their top 3 issues of concern regarding devolution. And we've also seen a drop in people putting the effects of the Windsor Framework in their top 3 issues of concern. There is a difference amongst people of different community backgrounds when it comes to what they're putting in their top issues, which is probably interesting to note. So not too surprising, perhaps, we see constitutional status of highest concern to strong unionists. So this is people putting it in their top 2 issues. Strongly nationalists, almost 4 out of 10 are putting it in their top 2, but not as much as strong unionists. For the non-aligned, by far the most important issue to them, to most of them, is health and social care. You can see the economy is of most concern to non-aligned and to slight unionists. We also see, if we look there at that second one across, that the effects of the Windsor Framework really is of not of high concern to most. Strong unionists, about a quarter of them are putting it in their top 2 issues. So it's definitely, as we've said consistently across the polls, really, those who strongly disagree that it should exist are those who prioritise it as an issue of concern as well. One last thing to note here is in relation to immigration. So there's been a very significant increase in slight unionists putting immigration in their higher issues of concern. So we can see there's not a vast amount of difference between strong and slight unionists and the proportion putting it in their top 2 issues. It's really very low down the issues of concern. In fact, non-aligned, slight and strong nationalists are generally speaking putting it in their bottom 2 issues of concern. On the Windsor Framework, looking at this by party now, we can see those dark grey bars are those who put it in their bottom 3, so Sinn Féin, SDLP, Alliance, really very likely to put in their bottom 3 issues of concern. The UUP, twice as likely to put it in their bottom 3 issues compared to their top 3 issues. For the DUP, there's been a drop. So in our last poll, 43% of DUP supporters, I think, were putting it in their top 3 issues. That's declined now to 30%. And indeed, 17 put it in their bottom 3. There's a difference there, though, with the TUV, so 2/3 of them are putting in their top 3 issues of concern. There isn't a huge women respondents are more likely to put in their bottom 3 issues of concern than men, and there's a slight class difference there too. So those from less well-off backgrounds are likely to put it in, twice as likely to put in their top 3 issues of concern. Over to David to talk about the summit.
Thanks, Katie. Before I go on, just to say that we're happy to take any questions you might have, so please do put them in the chat function on YouTube, and we'll come back to them at the end. Okay, so as I said at the beginning, we've got quite an important context for this particular poll, and that is the UK-EU summit back in May this year. This was the first time when the UK Prime Minister and the head of the EU institutions came together to discuss UK-EU relations. Symbolic because it's in huge contrast to where we were, say, 3 years ago, where the UK and the EU were barely talking to each other, partly because of the Windsor framework. Okay, now we were anticipating a closer relationship emerging with Labour coming to power. It took a bit of time for Labour to identify what its priorities were, and so possibly for some people there's not been as much progress as we might have anticipated. But nevertheless, we get the summit in May this year, where we see a number of documents adopted, particularly around security and defence issues, driven by the concerns about what's happening in Ukraine and the desire between the UK and the EU to cooperate on that. But what we also saw was this common understanding statement issued, which listed a whole variety of areas in which it was envisaged that the UK and the EU would pursue closer cooperation. Important, though, for the pursuit of closer cooperation is, as you see in paragraph 2 here, the commitment which exists to ensure that the withdrawal agreement and the trade and cooperation agreement are fully implemented. This is essentially the EU's preconditions for closer relationships. And important within that is obviously the implementation of the Windsor framework. As you see there, both sides, this is the UK and the EU, committing to the full, timely and faithful implementation of the existing obligations around the withdrawal agreement, around the Windsor framework and around the trade and cooperation agreement. Okay, so in terms of what was envisaged, or what is envisaged under the common understanding, it basically falls into sort of 5 pots. First of all, you've got security, defence and development cooperation. And that extends beyond just the security and defence around, say, the Ukraine question, but also issues such as health security and how you might cooperate in some disaster cooperation. A lot of emphasis, particularly driven by the UK domestic agenda, on how do you address irregular migration. And we see a number of initiatives being envisaged there. What we also see, and that is partly linked in some respects, internal security and judicial cooperation. We see, this has always been an area where I think the UK has been quite interested in developing cooperation with the EU, and there's a number of measures envisaged on that particular issue. And if you move to the right of the screen there, we see this box of issues called strengthening our economies while protecting our planet and resources. Essentially here we've got commitments around cooperation on climate, we've got cooperation around energy, but what the real 2 important areas as far as the Windsor framework is concerned is this commitment to work towards a common sanitary, phytosanitary SPS area. The significance of that is that if one is established, then a lot of the checks, formalities, checks, controls which apply to the movement of agri-food goods between Great Britain and Northern Ireland should fall away. Okay. A lot will depend on the actual terms negotiated. What we also see is progress or desire to establish progress towards linking emission trading systems, and that is important because of the introduction by the EU of the CBAM and what that might mean for the movement of goods between the UK and the EU, between Ireland, Northern Ireland and Ireland as well. Okay, so negotiations are beginning on those this autumn. We'll see where they actually lead to. The 5th box was one there labelled putting people at the centre of the EU-UK relationship, and here a lot of it is around the movement of young people, so a youth experience scheme, the possibility of the UK rejoining Erasmus, but also for people more broadly, the possibility of smoother border management and the UK or British nationals being able to use e-gates. Okay, so quite important in terms of the development of the UK-EU relationship, important for the Windsor framework. What we were interested in was how this might play out in terms of people's preferences in Northern Ireland. Okay, so we asked some questions in the survey on this, and we essentially got people to rank what they saw as the most important for them. And as with other examples of where we've asked people to rank, we basically divide this into the highest priorities and then down to their lowest two priorities. And if you look at the bottom there, what clearly comes out is that health and security cooperation, for example, on addressing pandemics and avoiding pandemics, seems to come through as the largest or the most prioritised concern for the majority of people in Northern Ireland. It picks up 60% of those people 60% of people identify as in their top four. Then what we have, and this reflects concerns which we've seen in previous polls, people wanting to see the establishment of this common SPS area to facilitate the movement of goods between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, as well as the UK and the EU. And then also interested in seeing reduction in restrictions of UK-EU worker movements. Okay. Other areas such as youth experience scheme, so with the border management, much lower down people's priorities, as is the question of climate change and environment protection. Okay, so it'd be interesting to see what comes out of the UK-EU relations on this. I think for addressing some of the concerns which continue to exist around the Windsor framework, the establishment of that common SPS area is going to be of vital importance. Okay, so the other important context here for this poll was the independent review that Lord Murphy has completed. I think some of the reaction to that review suggested a level of disappointment because he wasn't calling for radical change. One of the reasons for that was he had a very, very narrow remit. As he's indicated here, the review had to focus on what was achievable, proportionate, grounded in the political and legal realities of Northern Ireland, and also he was essentially required to put forward suggestions which could command cross-community support. Given the divisions that we know exist on the Windsor framework, this was a pretty tall order in some respects. Nevertheless, he made a number of recommendations, and they basically fall into sort of three blocks. One around the democratic deficit, so essentially the question of Northern Ireland feeding into decisions which relate to it under the Windsor framework. Second set of recommendations really focusing on how do you facilitate movement of goods, how do you address the concerns that business and traders have with the implementation of the Windsor framework. And then there was another box with other considerations. Okay. What we also took away from the report was a comment that he put in his conclusions, which was essentially the need for sustained dialogue on the part of the UK government with all communities and stakeholders, and a genuine commitment to shared governance if they were going to move towards a situation where the Windsor framework, when it comes to the next democratic consent vote, might obtain cross-community support. I don't think many of us are necessarily holding our breath on that one. Okay. Next steps for the report is it's going to be considered by the UK Parliament and the Northern Ireland Assembly, and then the UK government will respond to its recommendations within 6 months and then take forward recommendations to the EU as well. Important to note here is that this review is very much a unilateral UK initiative, and technically the joint committee of the UK and the EU does not necessarily need to deal with it, but I think it's going to be very difficult for it to be ignored because this is quite a significant piece of work. Okay, all right. So in terms of the recommendations, I say they fall into two areas. Democratic deficit, we've got them there, a lot to do with essentially facilitating the work of the Democratic Scrutiny Committee in the Northern Ireland Assembly, but also having greater transparency about how things like the Stormont break can work. And there's also a recommendation there to increase the resources of the Northern Ireland Executive Office in Brussels so that it can actually engage effectively with the EU on matters to do with the Windsor framework. And then the UK government should also look at broadening its inclusion of stakeholders in the meetings it has in various UK-EU fora. The other consideration I mentioned, that was mentioned in the recommendations, relates to Article 2 of the Windsor Framework. This is to safeguarding rights under the Belfast Good Friday Agreement that are upheld by EU law. And here, Lord Murphy picked up on a concern which exists that the UK government and the London Executive aren't necessarily giving sufficient regard to Article 2 when drafting legislation. Okay, so in terms of business, what we also have is a lot of emphasis placed on a UK-EU SPS agreement, addressing some of the support mechanisms in place for business in the operation of the Windsor framework. A desire to try and a recommendation to try and reduce as far as possible frictions on the movement of goods as they're affecting logistics and haulage businesses. And then thinking forward a little bit more to ensure that supply of veterinary medicines into Northern Ireland remains reliable, and equally that the arrangements in place under the Windsor Framework for human medicines are such that the availability of medicines continues despite what might happen in terms of diverse regulation between the UK and the EU. And then finally, picking up on one of the innovations of safeguarding the union to ensure that support is given to the independent monitoring panel and Intertrade so that they can assist in trying to identify and potentially put forward proposals for reducing frictions on GBNI movement of goods. Okay, so some of these, for a lot of people, might seem fairly arcane, but I think they're all designed to address some of the concerns which people were raising in the consultations that Lord Murphy had with stakeholders in preparing his review. Okay, in terms of how they've been, how people responded to them, I'm going to hand over to Katy.
So we see that, probably unsurprisingly, the most popular recommendations are that the UK government should consider all possibilities for reducing friction on GBNI movement of goods, and that both the UK government and the Northern Ireland Executive should emphasise dual market access benefits. And then slightly lesser importance is the UK government needing to be clear about the impacts of EU legislation on Northern Ireland, and then broadening its engagement with stakeholders on the Windsor Framework. When we look, it's quite interesting actually, there are significant community differences when it comes to the ranking of these recommendations. So unionists and non-aligned, but particularly unionists are most likely to put reducing GBNI friction in their top two issues of concern. And for nationalists, both strong nationalists and softer nationalists, they are much more likely to want to see the UK government and Northern Ireland Executive emphasise dual market access benefits. This relates, I think, also to that question of whether the Windsor Framework is good for the economy of Northern Ireland. This comes through that people would like to see that dual market access opportunity for Northern Ireland being emphasised more. Interestingly too, we see strong unionists being the most likely to put the UK government needing to be clear on the impacts of EU legislation in their top two issues of support when it comes to the recommendations from Lord Murphy. And notably, there aren't really many differences by community background on the wish to see broader engagement with Northern Ireland stakeholders. It may be of interest that strong nationalists are less likely than others to put that in their top two issues of concern. Now we come to the comments. So 234 people went to the trouble of writing comments at the end of the survey. And just to bring out some of the themes from this. So there's sense of disillusionment with Brexit. So partly those who are of the view that it has been a disaster, full stop. And then others who think it's been disastrously implemented in Northern Ireland in that there hasn't been a proper Brexit. So those views are quite ones we've seen repeated a lot in these surveys. Criticism of the Windsor Framework in relation to the Irish Sea border. There's also quite a clear theme coming through of people who see it, the sea border, in terms of some push towards Irish unification or some betrayal of the Good Friday Belfast Agreement. There are some frustrations expressed with respect to trade and movement of goods across the Irish Sea. Some specific examples given. There's some people commenting about that dual market access point, wanting to see more being made of it. There's also a theme that Lord Murphy picked up and the Northern Ireland Scrutiny Committee in the House of Lords picked up too, which is around the lack of information on the Windsor Framework. And then lastly, something that was very striking in this poll, more so than in other ones, is this very clear theme of distrust in political institutions, and most particularly comments and views and opinions that would generally be associated with hard right views. And so lots of various issues are raised, including climate change, quite a lot in relation to immigration, so-called sort of globalist agendas. The digital ID card proposal is mentioned as well. So that's quite prevalent in the comments. Also, some criticisms of the survey, some people criticising the length of it and complexity, and we apologise for that. Unfortunately, the topic is quite complicated, and we are very grateful to everybody who completes the survey and reads our questions carefully. But there's also comments criticising the survey, being suspicious about our intentions, etc., all fitting into that sort of sort of anti-elitist discourse that we see present in those comments.
Okay, I think back to me.
Back to you.
Thanks, Katie, for that. As I said earlier, we're more than happy to take any questions you might have on the polling and anything we've said so far. I'm just going to finish off with a few observations about what we might see coming up over the next months and years, because as probably we all appreciate, okay, even though it might be quite quiet on the Windsor Framework front at the moment, this thing isn't going away, it's still there, and there are still a lot of issues which people are raising concerning it, even if it's not necessarily making the headlines as much as it did in the past. Okay, I suppose, just to summarise, okay, there's lots of unknowns in the future, but there's a couple of things which have happened this month which will have an impact on the implementation of the Windsor Framework and some of its effects. One is there is this ongoing court appeal around the application of, or the application of parts, sorry, not the application, but the interpretation of Article 2. The Supreme Court heard the views, I think last week. We haven't got yet a date for when the Supreme Court will issue its ruling there, but I think that's going to be quite important, not just for Article 2, but I also think how people will see the Windsor Framework and its scope. Okay. What we also had published last week was the European Commission's work programme for 2026. This is where it sets out what its legislative priorities are. That will determine what legislative changes might come through affecting Northern Ireland under the Windsor Framework. The European Commission is committed to giving stakeholders in Northern Ireland a briefing on that to explain where it thinks that some of the impacts of the work programme will be felt. Okay, so that then leads into what we see on the right-hand side is to remember that under the Windsor Framework, the legislation which applies in Northern Ireland automatically is updated to reflect any amendments or replacements adopted by the EU. This places a considerable pressure on the Northern Ireland Assembly Democratic Scrutiny Committee to monitor what's going on, such that its effects are known, and also for MLAs to be considering whether they need to, or they want to try and move to trigger the Stormont break, if they think that the legislative changes will have a substantial impact on Northern Ireland liable to persist. We look back at this year, an attempt was made at the back end of 2024 to trigger the Stormont break, but that was turned down by the UK government because it did not believe that there was sufficient evidence there to say this was going to be as disruptive as people maintained. And what we also know is that there will be some new acts coming through to the Windsor to be applied to the Windsor framework. What's important here, where new acts is concerned, is that they do require the agreement of the United Kingdom, and the understanding after Safeguarding the Union was that the UK would only move to agree if there was an applicability motion in the Northern Ireland Assembly. Now, technically, the applicability motion is not required if there is not going to be a disruption to trade, and the UK government earlier this year took the decision that a number of measures that the EU wanted to add would not affect trade, therefore it did not need an applicability motion. There are going to be some pieces of legislation coming up which could impact trade, and the question there is going to be whether an applicability motion will be sought, and also whether an applicability motion will be agreed by a cross-community majority in the Assembly. As you can probably appreciate, this is all quite complex, but there could be issues coming up there in due course. For 2026, I suppose the key interest will be initially on what the UK government's response is to the independent review of Lord Murphy, whether it will carry out and take forward his recommendations. We've not yet have any real indication from the UK government as to what it will do, but it's got 6 months to produce its response, and so we're expecting that in January. Okay. Parallel to that, we've obviously got the developments following the UK-EU summit, where we're expecting negotiations to start before too long in terms of an SPS agreement, an emissions trading systems agreement, and also an agreement between the UK and the EU on electricity. All three of these have implications for the implementation of the Windsor framework, and more significantly, the extent to which there are checks, controls, formalities on the movement of goods between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. These being negotiations, we cannot necessarily predict when the outcome will be. Moreover, once if agreement is reached, we'll want to know what the scope of those agreements is. Even if they are agreed, they still have to then be approved by either side. So when they come into force is an interesting question. Now, that's significant because if you think back to what I said about the UK-EU summit, both sides are committed to the full, faithful and timely implementation of the Windsor framework. So therefore, what's already been agreed has to be implemented, even if some of the requirements will actually be lifted if an advanced SPS ETS agreement is adopted in due course. What this means is that there's this paradox that you've got the UK, you have to implement stuff in Northern Ireland under the Windsor framework, which subsequently you may not need to implement, but you're only not going to have to be implementing it if you've demonstrated that you can implement it, which seems to be a rather odd situation to be in, particularly when there are political consequences for this in terms of people's attitudes towards the Windsor framework in Northern Ireland. Okay. Looking slightly further ahead, we have the Assembly election, which we're anticipating 2027. That's significant in Windsor framework terms because in 2028, the Assembly will have the opportunity to vote again on whether it wants to continue with essentially the trading provisions of the Windsor framework when we have the democratic consent vote in December that year. Okay, so lots of unknowns there. It's going to be interesting to come back to some of this midway through next year to see where we are with the negotiations, and then hopefully towards the end of next year possibly have a bit more detail about what that new UK-EU relationship will contain, and also how that will play out on the Windsor framework. Okay, so plenty to come, and we'll try and pick up some of that in future Brexit clinics and in some of the polling we'll be doing in due course. But before we finish, we've got a number of questions that have come through. We haven't got too many, but if there are any more to, please let us know. So I will pick up the first one. Are we finding that those who we speak to understand the impact of the Windsor framework, and have we heard anything about the veterinary medicine situation? Impacts. I think there's a fair amount of awareness about what the impacts are. I think if we look at the reports which the Lord Murphy has produced, and also the Northern Ireland Scrutiny Committee have produced. There's a lot of detail in there, particularly in the evidence submitted, about what people think. We know that as part of the Lord Murphy's review, he issued a call for written evidence, and while the written evidence hasn't been published, the suggestion is that there was quite a large number of submissions made to him. So I think that the information is there, the feedback from people in Northern Ireland is made available. The question is the extent to which it is being necessarily listened to and acted on. I don't know if Katie got any views?
No, I mean, so the Scrutiny Committee sets out some of the means by which stakeholders can engage with the UK and the EU at the moment. And from that, there is that opportunity to improve UK-EU understanding of the experience in Northern Ireland and to improve communications there. So those structures have been established and they're being enhanced. And I think there is that sense of recognising that the Windsor Framework is a very unusual arrangement, and the need to keep an eye on how it's having an impact in Northern Ireland, I think is something that both the UK and the EU are well aware of. And as you say, David, those two reports really underscore that fact.
Okay. On the specific question of the veterinary medicine situation, so the grace period ends at the end of this year. I know the UK government issued a statement, I think back in July, which is on their website, about what it was doing to try and address the concerns, but I'm not aware that there's anything been published since declaring what the arrangements will be. No doubt there'll have to be some announcement before the end of the year. Okay. Second question we got coming through was about something which doesn't really get much attention now, although it was picking up a fair amount of attention a couple of years ago. This is this review of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, which is supposedly taking place next year. And the question is, well, what are our thoughts on that? What do we see the sticking points? And what might be the potential impact of an Irish EU presidency next year on that process? I get the impression that I might be answering this one.
Okay. You and you.
I'll have a first go. Okay. I think we've not really seen much around the review of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. I think partly because initially I think some people thought this was going to be an opportunity to renegotiate it, and the EU's position was, well, no, this is just a review of how it's being implemented. And then we get this switch to the sort of the development of a UK-EU cooperation, identifying where you might want to develop relations further. And I think that's broadly sort of taken over in terms of the priority for the UK and the EU rather than the review of the TCA. And the TCA review becomes more of a technical exercise. The fact that the EU and the UK agreed that you need full, faithful and timely implementation means to say that they are obviously monitoring what's happening. And I think what we're also seeing in the various committees that meet under the TCA arrangements is issues being picked up and taken forward where they can within the existing framework, and then being discussed also alongside that as part of the implementation of this common understanding adopted at the summit earlier this year. Okay. In terms of the Irish presidency, I think we have to be careful about what we might expect from anybody holding the presidency, because when you hold the presidency of the Council of the European Union, you're essentially chairing meetings and you're meant to be fairly neutral and not necessarily pursue your own agendas. That said, clearly, if with the Irish government holding the Council presidency, they do have the opportunity to flag issues which might be of interest to people which relate to the implications of European integration for the island of Ireland. We've not seen any formal announcements yet as to what their intentions might be there. I suppose one thing is there'll be a good number of EU 27 member state representatives coming to Ireland, and they'll be able to get a sense as to what's happening here. But I wouldn't necessarily expect too much in terms of addressing Windsor Framework issues coming specifically from an Irish Council presidency next year.
Yes, not least because they'll be wanting to demonstrate their commitment as an EU member state and not be associated too much with Brexit in the mind of their other member states.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's all the questions that have come through. If there are any questions subsequent to this, please do get in contact with us. We will be putting this recording online in due course. We'll also get the slides, a copy of the report out to you. So thanks very much for joining us. We'll be coming back probably at least 6 months' time when we do our next poll. Be interesting to see what the results are of that. But until then, thanks so much again for your attention and your interest in this, and we look forward to seeing you on another occasion.